Today is February 23rd, 2022, and my guest is author and economist Robert Pindyck of MIT. This is his second appearance on the program. He was last here in August of 2013 talking about climate change. His latest book is Climate Future, Averting and Adapting to Climate Change. Bob, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Now, this is a deeply, I would say, pessimistic and deeply optimistic book, which is quite an achievement. The other part I love about it is it embodies the motto of this program, which is, it's complicated. There's a lot of humility about what we know and don't know, which I deeply appreciated. Let's start with a line from the book. Quote, "The extent of climate change and its impact on the economy and society more generally is far more uncertain than most people think." First, what do you mean by that? And second, why do you think it's true?
Well, first of all, what I mean is fairly simple. I mean, we like to think that we know things, and we like people to give us clear numbers. So we want to know that tomorrow is going to rain. People have trouble with the idea that there's a 40% probability of rain or 80% probability. We like to be told things. People like to know that, or they want to hear things like, well, 30 years from now, the temperature is going to go up by 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius or whatever if we don't do X, Y, and Z. But the fact is that we face a lot of uncertainty about the climate system, about what's going to happen, and about what's the impact of what's going to happen. And I think we have to recognize the uncertainty. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. It doesn't mean that we should sit back and not worry about it. It just means that we have to be clear about the things we understand and the things we don't understand.
And as you point out, a lot of things in life are like this. We should have some comfort, even though it's uncomfortable, or at least some familiarity with this kind of issue. Although in this case, because it's related to public policy and it requires political action, that complicates it quite a bit. But
Right.
Certainly, as you argue in the book and just now, people don't like to hear anything like we don't know. They want to know, well, what's going to happen? And so I think the scientific community and the policy community, if anything, has done us a disservice with the certainty they've used around these issues.
I think that's absolutely right. And, we're told that we're going to have a climate catastrophe, or this will happen, or that will happen. There's some people who argue the other side and say nothing will happen. People make statements that this is what will happen. And the simple fact is we don't know what will happen. Even if we knew how much CO2, carbon dioxide, will be emitted by every country in the world over the coming 50 years, even if we knew that, we wouldn't know how much the temperature would increase as a result and what will happen to sea levels. We might have estimates, we might have a range of possibilities, but we don't know. And even if we did know, even if we knew precisely what the temperature will do and sea levels will do over the next 50 years, we don't know what the impact would be. We don't know whether that would be devastating to world GDP, to the world economy, whether it would be a little bit harmful, whether it would be moderately harmful. We don't have any data. We don't have any theory. We don't have any way of knowing what would happen. And, that's maybe unfortunate, but that's just the fact of life that we have to come to grips with.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in some detail, of course, but I can't help but think about economics in general and the uncertainty of any complex system. The interacting pieces of it, the complexity of those interactions are not empirically understood with anything like certainty. And as a result, that leads to two things. One, we mentioned already, discomfort. But the other thing it leads to is the temptation to lie, and in economics and I think in climate, to express that certainty out of either promotion, self-promotion, or a better, slightly more attractive motive, but I think incorrect, the motive that if we don't make it scary or we don't make it precise, there'll be this excuse for inaction, which you very clearly say in the book many, many times. Nothing of this uncertainty implies that, nothing, we shouldn't do anything then.
Right. That's absolutely right. And, you're right. It happens in almost every area of economics. people in business want forecasts. They want to know, for example, what will interest rates be a year from now? And I always joke with students and say, anybody who tells you that they can predict what interest rates will be a year from now is either a scoundrel or the chairman of the Fed, one or the other. And people want to know, what will the price of oil be a year from now or 5 years from now? And what will this be? Or what will happen to the stock market and so on? And we just don't know. And people make a lot of money by making believe that they know, by selling forecasts and making believe that they know, but they don't. So that's just how it is.
I have a feeling you don't get called by journalists very often to tell them what interest rates are going to be. Because when they called me about those things, what's the dollar going to be in 6 months? And I always say, I don't know. And then I'd say the same thing. And anyone who says they do know is a liar or a scoundrel. And then they'd say, well, I'd say a liar or a scoundrel. I wouldn't say chairman of the Fed. And then they'd say, oh, it's nice talking to you. Goodbye, because that's not useful to them. And that tells you something about the world, of course. But
no, that's right. And so one of the things that this book tries to do is clarify why it is. First of all, clarify what it is we know and don't know. It's not that we don't know anything. There's a lot that we do know. And there are areas where we know a lot. There are areas where we know a fair amount, but there's some uncertainty. And there are areas where we know almost nothing. So what I try to do in the book is clarify what it is we know, sort of know, and don't know, why it is that we don't know certain things, and then what the implications of that are in terms of policy.
So let's dig into this question of how we deal with this writ large. And I want to challenge it. But first, I want you to make the case. I mean, can't you argue that if there's so much uncertainty around this and so much imperfect knowledge, isn't the best thing to do to just kind of wait till we've resolved some of the uncertainty? And I'm going to let you answer, then I'll try to challenge it. But let's hear the answer first.
Well, let me give you a simple answer first, and that is, I don't know if you own your home. Let's assume you do. I'm sure a lot of listeners do own a home, and if you own a home, you don't know whether there'll be a hurricane and a tree will fall down on it, or it'll burn down. There'll be a fire. And if a tree falls down and there's a fire, you don't know how much damage there will be. A lot of uncertainty. Does that mean you shouldn't get insurance for your home? Most people have homeowners insurance exactly because they don't know. If you knew, then life would be a lot easier. In fact, a lot of people have life insurance. They don't know when they're going to die. So why do they buy life insurance? They don't know. But you need insurance. And it's the same thing with climate change. Look, we may be lucky, and it may be that 50 years from now, and we'll have another podcast in 50 years. I'm going to put it on my calendar.
Yeah, me too.
I schedule it now because I get very busy. So it may be that 50 years from now, we'll be in good shape. It may be that temperatures won't go up much. It may be that even if they do, it won't have much of an impact, and so on. That's great. It may be that we'll have a catastrophic outcome, that things will be terrible, that there'll be a large increase in temperature, and that the increase in temperature will have a very severe effect on the world economy. That's also possible. So we need to insure against the possibility of a catastrophic outcome.
One of the deepest things I've learned from Nassim Nicholas Taleb is that the average is often and frequently not at all what you should care about. Yes. So there might be an expected rise in temperature of, say, 1.8, 2.3 degrees Celsius over the next 50 years. But that really isn't what you care about. What you really care about is avoiding the worst case scenario, because not necessarily the worst case scenario. What you want to worry about is ruin. What you want to worry about is a catastrophic outcome that takes you out of the game and does not allow you to keep taking draws from the urn of life. So that means you want to avoid death mostly. There are costs of avoiding death, of course. You have to be careful. You want to avoid bankruptcy and ruin, financial ruin, if you're counting on, again, repeated plays to make this strategy you've employed rational. And so in this particular case, for me, even though I've been something of a skeptic and still am something of a skeptic for large action in response to climate change, and we'll talk more about that. It is very much the case that we should be worried about the worst case scenario if it's catastrophic. And in a way, one of the arguments is the worst case scenario is 5 degrees of warming from the pre-industrial baseline, say, of Celsius degrees. But I think there are actually other worst case scenarios, which you didn't actually explore in your book, which I'll bring up. And that's what I think we should be worried about. And their likelihood, the fact that they're remote or small probability is not a comfort, because all that does is means that the average is lower. That's not what we should worry about either personally or policy-wise in general.
Right. No, that's right. It is unlikely that the tree will fall on your house, but nonetheless, you have insurance.
Well, I'd say it more strongly. It's unlikely the tree will fall on your house, but you should cut it down if it's near your bedroom, because it's not the probability alone that counts. It's another thing I learned from Taleb. It's the actual outcome, and that could be death if the tree crushes you. So rather than insure for the financial damage, you should cut the tree down, which is a way of avoiding the worst case scenario.
No, that's right. And that's expensive to do. That still costs money. You cut the tree down, you still have to, hire somebody to come and cut it down, and take it away, and all that. Still expensive. Which,
in theory, you could argue, but it's such a remote event, but it could kill you. So maybe best to cut it down. So for me, the argument for a little less intervention would be that some interventions also have a worst case scenario. You talk about irreversibility a little bit in the book, but I think the issue would be if we got together as a world, which seems appealing in a problem like this. This is a global problem. You many times mentioned the challenge of a single nation trying to solve this is not really the wisest policy. So if we try to solve it as a world, I want to worry about the worst case scenario of what it would mean to empower certain dramatic actions to take place extra nationally through some global force, that generally I would worry about the concentration of power in the hands of people who are not accountable and so on. So that would be the flip side of the worst case scenario of worrying about climate change.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about that. I explain in the book that we should try to reduce CO2 emissions. And I certainly would never argue that, don't worry about emissions, don't do anything to reduce emissions. We should try to reduce CO2 emissions. We should try to do it efficiently, lowest cost, which typically involves a carbon tax. But putting that aside, we should do it, but we have to do it globally. And, if the United States and Europe, which together account for 30% of global CO2 emissions now, reduced their emissions next week to 0. That's not feasible, but suppose it happened. Well, that would leave 70% of emissions that's still growing and growing rapidly. It wouldn't do the job. And we're not going to reduce our emissions to 0 next week. So the only way you can really reduce emissions in a meaningful way is through a global agreement. What are the chances of that happening? As I explain in the book, the United States and Europe are making headway. They will reduce emissions, but there are a lot of countries that won't, and at least not over the next 20 years or so. And, countries like China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand, I can go on and on, Indonesia, Malaysia. And the impact of that, the result of that is that it's very likely that emissions are going to continue to grow over the next couple of decades, which means it's very likely that we are going to see larger increases in temperature than the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius that some climate scientists have said is kind of the critical limit. We're already at 1 degree. We've already increased the temperature by 1 degree. So we don't have very far to go to hit 2 degrees.
So, it's one of those tricky problems. It's only 1 more degree, but it is a doubling. But it is a worrisome problem. And you get at, I want to let you expand on this, you get at what economists call stock and flow problem. There's the stock of existing CO2 in the atmosphere, and the flow is the additional amounts or negative amounts, imaginably, the net flow that continue. And if the U.S. and Europe went to 0, and if the rest of the world went to 0, there'd still be a lot of carbon in there. It's not like it's going to get cooler. So talk about that, because I think that's that the fact that the past has happened has implications for the future that I think people don't fully appreciate. And you talk about it very nicely.
Yeah. So what matters is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And as you say, when we emit CO2, it increases the concentration. The concentration lasts, the CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 100, 200 years or more, a long, long time. And the concentration has been increasing. An increase in the concentration is what causes the temperature to go up. But there's a lag. So if you doubled the CO2 concentration next week, the temperature would go up, but it wouldn't go up next week. It would go up after about 30 years, 20, 30, 40 years, gradually. So even if we cut emissions to zero worldwide, this is complete fantasy, but if we did it, cut emissions to zero tomorrow, you still have an increase in the concentration that's occurred over the last 30, 40 years that's still going to have an effect on temperature. So the temperature will still continue to rise as a result of past increases in the CO2 concentration. Now, I think that, in fact, the CO2 concentration is going to continue to go up. But even if under some fantasy we stopped emitting CO2, we still would have the problem of past increases are still affecting temperature.
Yeah, the point I was making before about the risk of worst case scenario in fighting climate change is that if you think that the future of the human race is at stake, which some people do, and not just the human race, but the biosphere generally, that justifies radical social change where you could mandate. If governments had enough power and were motivated to do this, those are two really different things. Hard to remember that sometimes. But if government had enough power and if they were inclined to focus on climate change and not pay attention to people's pain and suffering, they could mandate zero, just like we could have zero COVID from day one if we had put everyone in house, not in day one, but shortly thereafter, if we had done something closer to what China did, put people under literal house arrest, not lockdown, but house arrest. You can quarantine people using the army. And if you thought that the future of the human race was at stake, you might make a case for that. You could then argue whether that would be a human race you'd want to be a part of if it required so much tyranny or worse. It's not just the orders, it's what it might lead to in future malfeasance that I worry about when power is concentrated. But obviously, that is a possible outcome. There are scenarios that are that bleak, and that does justify dramatic action, you could argue.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that. And what I argue in the book is, first of all, when we talk about existential threat to the human race, we should get to that. There are a number of things that the human race has to think about. Climate is only one of them. Let's leave that for a moment. What I argue in the book is fairly simple, which is that, well, first of all, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to reduce CO2 emissions or net emissions minus what we bring back from the atmosphere. It's very unlikely we're going to reduce emissions sufficiently and sufficiently quickly to prevent a temperature increase greater than 2 degrees. And that there's a very good chance, we don't know, but there's a good chance that the temperature will increase by 3 degrees Celsius, maybe more, by the end of the century. We don't know what the impact of that would be. It may be moderate because there's adaptation can take place. It may be severe. But what we do need to do is think about adaptation and what we can do to adapt to climate change, what we can do to reduce the impact of higher temperatures. And there are a variety of things we can do. We do some of them already. But that's, I think, where we are and what we need to think about in terms of policy.
Yeah, we'll turn to adaptation. But the way I'm hearing you say it, and that's the way I take it in the book as well, your focus on not focus, but you're taking adaptation seriously is, if anything, is really it's a public choice conclusion. There's nothing on the horizon that suggests that the peoples of America and Europe let alone China or India, or have any stomach for the kind of severe restrictions that would lead to a dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions. And therefore, adaptation is likely to be the most attractive strategy given that reality. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes. Yeah. In other words, you say, okay, look, there's a limit to what we can do. There's a limit to what we can expect. We can't expect India to reduce its emissions to zero, and their emissions are growing and are going to continue to grow. We can't expect that. That means that we have to be realistic about what's going to happen to temperature. And that means that we have to figure out what to do in response. Do we just sit back and say, that's really too bad? I mean, we tried to reduce emissions, and Europe did, and the US did, and some countries did, and what a shame, but that's life. No, we have to then go the next step and say, all right, what do we do if temperatures rise by 3 degrees or more Celsius? And that's where adaptation comes in.
Just one more footnote before we move on to some various policy responses. I searched for the word scenario in your book and found there are over 100 occurrences of that word in a roughly 200-page book, which is a way of, cataloging the fact that there's uncertainty about this. Why do you think there is so much uncertainty? We've hinted at it earlier, but I want to hear your version.
Yeah.
Why is there so much uncertainty given that there are an enormous number of world-class, first-rate scientists desperate to understand the problem more fully?
So there are two kinds of uncertainty, or two aspects to the uncertainty. The first is over the climate system, which is, if you have X amount of CO2 entering the atmosphere, and this is what happens to the concentration, what will happen to the temperature, what will happen to sea levels, and so on. And the problem there is like predicting the weather. Meteorology is a very advanced science, but there's a limit to how well we can predict the weather, the rainfall, and so on. There's just limits to our ability to do that, not because we don't have a lot of information, not because we haven't done lots of good work in meteorology. It's just the nature of the system. And the same thing is true with the climate system. And, we have an idea of what will happen. And climate scientists have developed very good models of what could happen if emissions increase and so on. But there's uncertainty. And the climate scientists themselves, in the papers that look at temperature increases, they attach probability distributions or confidence bounds around their estimates of what will happen to the temperature. They understand that. And part of the climate science is understanding the extent of the uncertainty. Why is there uncertainty? What's going on that's creating the uncertainty? So the first area is the climate system itself. It's just inherently complicated. It's not that we don't know anything. It's not that we haven't done lots of work. We being climate scientists, but there just remains a certain amount of uncertainty. We just don't know. Then you get to the next part, which is the impact of higher temperatures or higher sea levels. Even if we could write down precisely what will happen to the global mean temperature in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years, and so on, what will happen to the sea levels in 10, 20, 50 years, and so on? Even if we knew precisely, then the question is, okay, so what? What would the impact be? If the impact would be mild, then who cares? Why do we need to do anything? But if the impact is severe, if the impact causes lots and lots of economic and social damage, then we do need to do something. Why don't we know what's going to happen? Well, the reason is that there is no theory. We have no economic theory, no physical theory, no theory from chemistry, physics, anything that we can use to predict the economic impact of higher temperatures over long periods of time. And secondly, we have no data. We've never experienced a 3 degrees Celsius increase in terms of the modern world, the industrial world, experiencing a 3-degree temperature increase. It's never happened. So we have no data. We have data. People look at fluctuations in weather, and they look and say, gee, there was a hot summer, it was really hot, and agricultural output went down and so on. But that's weather. That's not climate. That's an unexpected hot summer. That's not the same as a gradual, persistent increase in the average temperature. It's a different thing. So we've never experienced it. We don't have data. We don't have theories. We don't have a way to figure out what's going to happen if temperature goes up by 3 degrees.
And of course, we also don't understand, can't predict, can't forecast. Well, you talk about carbon intensity, the amount of carbon that gets released for a certain amount of, say, economic activity. That's gone down over time. Will it continue to go down? Probably, might. How much? Not so sure. The kind of activity, unpredictable. The mix of activities of different carbon intensities. So all of that uncertainty is layered on top of it. I think the way I would think about it as a fan of emergent order is that the feedback loops embedded in the system are such that they cannot be statistically isolated and then improve a forecasting procedure. There's too many interactions across the different feedback loops within the system. And as a result, it's a crude forecasting problem that can't be done the way we would forecast less complex systems. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's the climate science side of it. That's absolutely right. That's why we don't know exactly what will happen to the temperature. But on the economic impact side, we just don't know. We just don't have any theory, really. I mean, we say, gee, it gets warmer, that'll hurt agriculture. Well, I mean, you adapt. You don't just plant the same things in the same places. You adapt. We've done that historically. We've adapted to higher temperatures when people moved from the East Coast to the center of the United States and encountered more severe weather, more severe climate. They planted different things. That's how they adapted. So we don't know the extent to which that will happen. And that's why it's so difficult for us to determine what the impact would be of higher temperatures.
We'll come back to that story about the adaptation because I find it so interesting. But first, I just want to ask, a lot of people are going to hate this book, aren't they?
So first of all,
like we talked earlier, they really don't. I don't want to hear this message. I don't like this, and it sounds a little too pessimistic on the knowledge side. So, and it sounds like it could excuse, even though you don't agree with it, it could excuse some people saying, since we don't know anything, we have to just wait and see. Yeah. They're not going to like that. I mean, there are other things they're not going to like either. We'll get to those too. But the general theme of the book is going to make a lot of people mad, I think.
It already has. So, I mean, I've written, this book is sort of a culmination of a lot of work I've been doing over the past decade. And in the last couple of years, I've written papers and given talks about this with this basic message. And I've gotten a lot of angry feedback. I mean, people, first of all, they call me a climate denier. Well, I'm not a climate denier. I write in the book very clearly that we need to do something. 2 things: try to reduce emissions and think about adaptation. So I'm certainly not a climate denier. People say, look, all this talk about what we don't know. We know everything. We know a lot. We know it's going to be an existential threat. Well, the fact is, we don't know that much. We know something. We don't know everything. And then people say, as you suggested, all this talk about uncertainty, we won't do anything. It'll lead to inaction. Well, that's possible. People could read this and say, aha, this guy says that we don't know things, therefore, who needs a carbon tax? I make it very clear in the book that that's not the right conclusion. We talked about this, insurance. That's not the correct conclusion. But there's some people who say, that's what's going to happen. So it already has generated lots of angry feedback.
What we're talking about is really what makes this, I don't want to overstate it, Bob, but it's kind of a brave book. In general, admitting ignorance is not the road to influence. It's the road to being ignored. I'm thinking about COVID, for example, in the middle of this pandemic. The number of people who asserted things as if they knew what was going to happen. I'll start with me. I can't tell how many times in the early days I said, I think in about a month, I think things will be back pretty well. And then I realized a month later, I kind of misread that. And that kept happening until I finally realized I have no idea what I'm talking about to my wife. I knew I was limited knowledge of the future. I didn't. It wasn't like I was trying to reassure people out in the real world, just in my household. But I was also trying to reassure myself. I was trying to tell myself, yeah, I think it's going to be okay, and I was wrong. But a lot of people forecast deaths, normalcy, you name it, and I think it had a devastating impact on the quality of debate, and its real cost will be seen in the future as in the deterioration of trust from people who should have known better and often were overconfident about what worked or didn't work, whether it's masks, vaccines, normalcy, this variant, when it's going to get better, when it's going to get worse, how many people die, what's going to happen in hospitals, all of that stuff. It's the same problem in many ways. It's a complex system we knew a lot. Like you say, in the same example, we knew a lot, but we didn't know everything. And people had trouble admitting that. And I think it really harmed our policy response and our policy response of the future.
No, I think that's right. And it's true in all of these areas where we have complex policy issues. And, from relatively small things like what's going to happen to inflation and what should central banks do about interest rates, what should government spending be in the face of inflation, should we worry about it, to bigger things like climate, pandemics, and so on.
So let's start partway through the book now. We have to face the reality you're suggesting that because of past emissions, because of the unlikelihood of major reductions in emissions in the near future, we have to accept the close to reality that we're going to have growing emissions going forward. And then we're facing the policy issue of now what. So outline what you think a thoughtful policy response should be given that reality. In other words, Don't put your head in the sand, you're saying. Don't pretend we're going to solve this problem so we don't have to do anything really hard, different kind of hard thing. We're going to do, that's done. That's baked in, if you'll pardon the expression, more or less. Now we have to figure out some alternatives. What are those alternatives? What would you say we should do?
So first of all, we should still try to reduce emissions as much as possible. And we should do it as efficiently as possible. And for an economist, efficiently means lowest cost to society. And, some of your listeners are not going to like this, but the best way to do it, the most efficient way, is a carbon tax. It's simple and it's efficient. You simply, you're causing damage, you pay for the damage. And a carbon tax does that. When you burn carbon, you're causing damage. We call that an externality. You're causing damage to the environment. We price that and you pay that as part of the use of carbon, burning carbon. So we should try to reduce emissions, do it as efficiently as possible. It has to be done globally, which means try to reach some kind of global agreement as best as possible. That's the first thing. Second thing is what we ought to do about emissions. What is likely to be done about emissions? We have to recognize that despite our best intentions, it's likely that the world, not the US, not Europe, the world will not reduce emissions fast enough or sufficiently enough to prevent temperature increases in excess of 2 degrees. We don't know whether there'll be a temperature increase of 3 degrees or more. Maybe we'll be lucky. We don't know. But we may be unlucky and we may see a temperature increase well above 3 degrees. So we have to recognize that despite our best intentions, there's a good chance we're going to see temperatures well in excess of 2 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? Well, we don't know what the impact of that will be. Will it be very, very harmful to the world economy? Will it be moderately harmful? A little bit harmful? We don't know, but we need to be ready for that. And the way you get ready is through adaptation. The way you do that is through varieties of adaptation over sea level increases, temperature increases, and so on. So that's what we have to do. We have to work now. Governments have to invest in adaptation now, not wait 20 years.
We'll talk about some of the range of adaptation that may be possible. I just want to push back a little against the the way you phrase that. I don't know if you meant it the way you actually phrased it. You phrased it in everyday speak, probably not economist speak. You say we should reduce emissions as much as possible. Of course, we could ban all kinds of things. Those are politically unattractive, but even if they were politically acceptable, you might be hesitant for all kinds of reasons, to not go to zero emissions. Even, in other words, you might not want a carbon tax that would be the so-called efficient carbon tax or optimal carbon tax, because, as Coase pointed out, it's not always the case that pricing externalities is the right approach, right? Taxing negative externalities, subsidizing positive ones. That Pigouvian, named for A.C. Pigou, that Pigouvian approach has an attractiveness to it, but it actually ignores the potential for adaptation to be a lower cost method of coping with the higher carbon. Now, when you have catastrophic change, adaptation is not on the table. Right. You know, if what we're talking about was the elimination of, say, biodiversity, which I don't think you mentioned, some people do worry about it with respect to climate change, in which case you wouldn't want to argue, well, we'll adapt to world without wildlife or whatever it is. We might say that's a primal value I don't want to trade off for all kinds of reasons. And so I'm not going to adapt to that. I want a more intense carbon tax. But a carbon tax by itself is sometimes portrayed by economists as the solution. And I think it's more complicated. And I think because of Coase, and I think your adaptation point really brings that out.
Let me explain why economists like the carbon tax, why I think a carbon tax is the right way to go. There's a question as to how big the tax should be, how far you go. But if you decide you want to reduce emissions, a carbon tax is the most efficient way to do that. Why is it? You know, I give this example in the book where you buy a new car, okay? And you want a new car, you go out, you buy it, you pay for it. Nobody's going to give it to you for free. You pay for it, okay? Now you're going to take your car and you're going to go on a long trip. Well, you need gasoline. And you got to pay for that gasoline. Okay. Now, suppose your car, by mistake, you smash into your neighbor's car, which is parked on the street. You know, it was an accident. You smash into it. You probably I would think that you'd have to pay the neighbor for that damage. Your insurance would do it. You do it through your insurance. But you caused damage, and you're going to have to pay for that damage. All right. If you take your car and run into, smash it into your neighbor's house, can be even more damage that you're going to have to pay for. When you go on your trip and you burn gasoline, burn carbon, you're emitting CO2, and that's causing damage. We call that damage the social cost of carbon, because it's a cost that's borne by society, not by you. You pay whatever for each gallon of gasoline, $3 a gallon, $4 a gallon, whatever. That's the direct cost to you. But in addition, there's a social cost. So all we're doing is asking you to pay for the damage you're causing. That's the idea of a carbon tax. You're paying for the damage you caused. And we try to estimate that damage. Again, we don't know exactly what it is. There's uncertainty. We come up with an estimate and we say, look, this is what you're doing. You paid $4 for the gallon of gasoline. But on top of that, you caused $1 worth of damage to society. We should add that to the cost of gasoline. That will reduce your emissions by the right amount. So that's the argument behind a carbon tax. There are other ways to reduce emissions. They're not as efficient. They don't work as well.
Well, just to reinforce your point, even though I don't agree with it 100%, but to reinforce it, it also says, well, if you have a really inefficient car, you might be encouraged to buy a car that's more gas efficient if gasoline's 20%, 25% more expensive. And so,
exactly.
So when you say it reduces the amount of emissions efficiently, it's because it encourages people to make choices that it doesn't mandate who should buy a smaller car. It might be you have a large family and you have to, it's worth it to you, in which case that would be okay. But someone who doesn't have a large family and has just by chance bought a large car because they like large cars might decide, well, it's not worth it all. So all those choices are taking place in complex ways with millions of people. The carbon tax doesn't try to figure out who should have the smaller car. It just lets everybody kind of figure out for themselves, and it works. It's a centralized solution that encourages decentralized action. The problem is that that might not be the best way to avoid the damage. So if you had no other options, for sure, there's an efficient argument there. But you could argue, I'm not saying this is true, it just Coase encourages you to imagine this possibility, which I think is mind expanding. It could be that your neighbor should not park on the street. And that's a cheaper way to avoid the harm from the damage you did than your insurance. And so you should be allowed to bang into your neighbor, and your neighbor then reacts and says, oh, I guess I shouldn't park on the street. My other neighbor is a bad driver. And so you could argue, again, not saying it's fact or true, but it could be true, that we shouldn't have a carbon tax. We should let people impose those social costs. And so society will find other ways to reduce the damage that are cheaper than not driving as much, say. And those cheaper alternatives, and by cheaper, I don't just mean monetarily, but in terms of true cost to human well-being, those could include, for example, buying an air conditioner. Just take a trivial example, right? Climate change, like summer, leads to discomfort, and tragically, it sometimes leads to death at extreme heats. And so it could be, again, to even take it to a crazier level, we should subsidize air conditioning, not tax carbon, if it's really easy to be comfortable.
Sure.
Right? That would be the argument.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the problem is that as you know, an air conditioner emits heat.
Yeah,
the
a good
air
example.
inside is cooled, the air outside is warmed. And air conditioners use electricity, and much of the electricity we produce now is made with coal or oil or gas. So it's not a great solution.
It's a hypothetical example.
There aren't many great alternatives. I mean, adaptation is something we do, but there aren't a lot of alternatives to a tax. Look, the kinds of things we do.
The alternative would be to move north, right? Which is what, of course, people do automatically. They do adapt those kind of move away from coastline if sea level's rising. And we lose something with that too. And that's not free either. So it's about trade-offs there. That I think just Coase expands your mind to imagine a richer set of trade-offs.
No, I think you consider all those things, and that's right. People will move away from the coastline, to more inland. There's some countries where that's not feasible. Yeah. Much of Southeast Asia is at sea level. Bangladesh is at sea level, so it's not feasible everywhere. What we're doing now, as an alternative to a carbon tax, is extremely inefficient. What we're doing now is picking things to do, subsidies, mandates to reduce emissions. So an example of this is subsidizing electric cars. Electric cars are very nice, very, very nice. Of course, you need electricity, so you got to figure out a way to make the electricity without burning carbon. But assuming you could somehow do that, you could decarbonize the entire electric sector. If you could do that, then electric cars would certainly emit less CO2 than gas-powered cars. The problem is that it's very nice, it's very expensive. What you're doing is subsidizing something that some people will want. And by the way, the people who buy electric cars tend to be high income. And what you're doing is giving a subsidy to the wealthy. They're the people who buy electric cars, not low income people. And so, it's very, very inefficient to decide that we're going to reduce emissions by subsidizing electric cars. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't buy electric cars. A carbon tax would push people to electric cars because it will raise the price of gasoline. So naturally, some people will move to electric cars, not because they're getting a subsidy, but because the alternative, which is to burn gasoline, becomes more expensive.
But as you point out, and others have pointed out, and we talk about a little bit on the program now and then, whether, as you alluded to, whether an electric car is carbon friendly kind of depends on where the electricity comes from. In the early days, and I think it's probably still true, because there's not a lot of demand for electricity at night. It's a relatively effective way to charge your car at night without adding a lot to the carbon footprint of your driving. If more people start to own electric cars, that will require larger capacity at night. All of a sudden, you're driving a coal-powered car that looks like an electric car, if that's the source. But it makes the point that you make in the book that if you have nuclear-powered electricity, you're going to have a much smaller carbon footprint, and yet nuclear power is very unpopular with environmentalists. Talk about that. You make the case for nuclear in the book, or some of the appeal of nuclear, and I think it's an incredibly important point about its safety. So talk about that relative to alternatives.
First of all, people have a tendency to overestimate very small risks and underestimate large risks. Let me give you an example. If you ask somebody, what's the chance of you're dying on an airplane? You're going to fly from, I'm in Boston to Chicago, and what's the chance of a crash and you'll die? People overestimate that risk. It's extremely, extremely low probability. And then you say, well, what about driving to Chicago? And say, well, that's safer. Well, it's not. I mean, there's a much higher risk of dying in an automobile accident if you drive from Boston to Chicago or New York or wherever. So we tend to not have a good sense of what the real risks are. And nuclear is an example of that. All of the studies now show that the risk, given current technology, not the technology in the Chernobyl years of 40 years ago or so, the current technology, the risk of a catastrophic accident with a nuclear power plant is exceedingly low, all right? And as a result, we have to consider nuclear because it is the cleanest way, a very clean way to make electricity. You don't need to store it. You don't need to deal with the storage problem. You generate electricity without emitting any CO2. There are issues that people worry about, like nuclear proliferation. Will the enriched uranium, or more likely the plutonium that comes out of the spent fuel rods, be stolen and converted into bombs? Well, these are risks that you have to deal with, and you have to figure out ways of making sure that we control the waste material that comes out of a nuclear power plant. And the other point is, if you look at death rates from the production of oil or coal relative to nuclear, coal kills lots and lots and lots of people. We don't worry about that because they aren't us. I don't work in a coal mine. But people who do experience very high death rates from black lung disease, accidents, and so on. We don't worry about that because we're not there in the coal mine. Burning coal, leave out the CO2, generates particulates, little fine grains of pollution that when people breathe causes all kinds of diseases. And, we don't think about that so much. So coal, and for that matter, oil, is far, far more dangerous in terms of the threat to lives lost, than nuclear power is. So I view nuclear power as a relatively safe option, and it's not something that we should simply push away because we worry about it, we don't like it. It's something that we have to consider, we have to use as part of a strategy to decarbonize the electricity sector.
You could argue, I don't know if this is what people actually feel, but you could argue this is just an application. People's unease with nuclear power is just an application of the relative unimportance of average outcomes. The fact that in the past, so it's super rational to be against nuclear power because in the past, true, nuclear, the total number of nuclear deaths, even when you include Chernobyl, forget the fact that we've gotten better at it, is dwarfed by the deaths from coal mining, for the workers, particulate matter for the general population, and so on. And yet people, quote, irrationally don't like nuclear power, but it could be simply that they feel, perhaps correctly, that there's even though it's very small, there is a chance of a catastrophic outcome that makes them uncomfortable, especially in their backyard. And so that's one possibility. But the other part's just a little bit more visceral and interesting. As you point out in the book, MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging. I think I got that right. Did I get that right? MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Used to be called nuclear magnetic resonance. And they're like, I don't like that. I'm not going to you can't do that on me. And we have perhaps just an irrational or visceral, it's like calling it, scorpion magnetic resonance imaging. It's like, I don't like scorpions. They give me the creeps. So, people associate it with nuclear weapons, which is horrific, and so they don't like it. Maybe we need to rename it the way we've renamed certain fish. You give it a certain name that sounds romantic, and maybe it would sell better politically.
Yeah. Yeah. You read the footnotes in the book too, which is good. And there is a footnote about MRIs. And, I've had numerous ones on my shoulder and my knees and whatever, orthopedic injuries. And when the technology was developed, the way an MRI works is that a very, very high magnetic field is applied to, let's say, your knee, whatever they're looking at. And then radio waves are imposed, and the nucleus of the atoms of certain materials resonate and give back the radio wave. So that's how you can determine what's going on in the thing you're looking at. So it's the nucleus, and that's why it was originally called nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, because it's the nucleus that resonates, all right? And it was an MRI, and people got upset. They didn't like the word nuclear, so they got rid of the word and called it just MRI, and now everybody's happy. And maybe that's what we need to do with nuclear power. I'm not sure what the right word would be, but maybe we need a new word.
I think it was Alfred Kahn who said, "You don't call it a recession, call it a banana. Maybe it won't be so frightening to people." But again, truth in advertising doesn't seem to be that seems to be a good idea. Let's say you're the czar of climate change, and let's say the United States, and not the world. There is no, say, world czar, but we could imagine a United States situation where there was the power to do more than we're doing now. Doesn't have to go through. Let's just say it doesn't have to go through Congress. You're in charge. I'm going to give you a big budget. What do you do? What's your mix of carbon tax, adaptation? And then after you tell me that, we'll talk some more in detail about what adaptations might be attractive. But do you have a plan? What would be a good plan?
Yeah, I mean, what I would do in first of all, you have to be clear. The United States is not going to solve the problem if we reduce.
Correct.
We account for 15% of the world emissions. If we reduced our emissions to zero next week, that would make it would help, but it would make a small dent. It would not come close to solving the problem. Nonetheless, I would impose a carbon tax, at least a small carbon tax, to acknowledge that there's an externality, to acknowledge that there's a social cost of burning carbon, with the hope that would encourage other countries and would help to lead to an international agreement, which is what we really need to reduce emissions. So that's the first thing. Second thing I would do is start investing now in various forms of adaptation. There's some very simple things we can do. And, you mentioned houses on the coastline. Take in Florida, people build vacation homes or actual homes right on the beach, knowing that there's a good chance those homes are going to get washed away if there's a hurricane. And we think that if temperatures increase quite a bit, there'll be more hurricanes, more severe hurricanes. And that would mean that more of those homes will be washed away. Well, why do people build those homes on the beach? And the reason is the insurance that they pay is subsidized by the US government. We subsidize people to basically buy these homes in places where you shouldn't be building homes. And we do that through the federal insurance program. We provide a big subsidy so that if you build a home on the coast of Florida, right on the beach, and there's a chance it's going to get washed away, the US government will cover it. Not completely, but much of the cost of the insurance is covered by the government, all right? Why do we do that? Because wealthy people who own these homes don't want to pay more for insurance, and they vote and they support politicians financially, and developers who build these homes have a strong lobbying power, and they're able to lobby and prevent the reformulation of these insurance rates to be actuarially fair. So the result is we subsidize this. Well, a simple thing to do is stop subsidizing it. That's all. Just say, fine, you want to build a home on the coast, on the beach that may get washed away, that's okay, but you pay for the insurance yourself. Don't expect the government to subsidize that insurance. Very simple. And the result is you'll have fewer homes built on the beach and fewer homes that get washed away.
It's a classic bootlegger and Baptist problem. It's a bootlegger Baptist, for listeners who haven't heard it, is the idea that there's a self-interested motive for political action, and then there's sort of a good-hearted motive that appeals to people's emotional empathy. So in the aftermath of a hurricane, people say, well, it's not fair that this person has to suffer through this disaster. This is an act of nature, an act of God. It's not their fault. It's the right thing. Forgetting that leads to a world where people tend to build more homes on the coast for the next 50 years. Many of them are wealthy. Be better if they didn't build them at all. Probably. Probably. Okay, so that's one, is get away, stop subsidizing things that lead to damage that's paid for by others, for sure. What else?
Well, since we're on the subject of flooding, you know that we worry about an increase in the sea level. We can't predict how much the sea level will rise. We don't even know what will happen to the temperature, but even if we knew that the temperature would go up by 3 degrees, we don't know what that would do to sea levels. It might be a moderate increase, a small increase, a very big increase. We don't know. But we worry about that, and correctly so, because there might be a large increase. Well, what do? What you do is you use seawalls and dikes and things like that to prevent the possibility of major flooding should there be strong hurricanes. This has been done historically for well over 1,000 years. You know, the Netherlands, most of the Netherlands is below sea level, and people live there quite comfortably because they have a system of dikes. The earliest ones were built around 800, about 1,200 years ago. And so in the Netherlands, they don't worry too much about flooding because they have a very, very complex, sophisticated system of dikes. There's a proposal to build a seawall around Lower Manhattan to prevent the kind of thing that happened, I forgot how many years ago, 5, 6 years ago, and there was a hurricane that flooded Lower Manhattan. The seawall would be below normal sea level. You wouldn't see it. The purpose is not to prevent an increase in the sea level. The purpose is to prevent waves from coming over and flooding Lower Manhattan, because that's what happens. It's not that the average sea level goes up and Manhattan's underwater. It's that the higher sea level combined with hurricanes can lead to large waves that would inundate parts of the city. So there's a proposal to do that, and it's being studied, and there are estimates, and it would cost $2 billion to build that seawall. But that's something that we might want to invest in, because it would prevent the flooding of Lower Manhattan. And there's a lot of real estate in Lower Manhattan. So, you could say, well, just leave Lower Manhattan, move away. But that's not economically sound. So that's a very sensible thing to do. And there are all kinds of things like that. Enhancing the dikes, the levees and the dikes, the levee system around New Orleans, for example. There are many, many ways in which we can use seawalls, levees to reduce the risk of flooding from hurricanes and higher sea levels.
I'm glad you added that point about real estate in Manhattan, because, of course, the seawall's a form of subsidized insurance that encourages people to stay there. Implicitly, you're saying that it's not just the value, I assume, the monetary value, but the fact that it's nice to live near the ocean. And we could just all retreat into the center of the country, in theory, not for maybe in Southeast Asia, but in parts of the United States where we could all move to higher ground. But we're presuming there's some value to being close to water, and as human beings, I think we do like that. Whether we should be subsidizing large beach homes is a somewhat different issue. They're related, but they're not the same.
Yeah, I think beach homes are quite different from a whole city like Manhattan.
Yeah.
I think it's quite different. So there's a huge amount of economic activity that takes place in Manhattan, and you can't just pick up everything and leave. That's not so easy. And that means you have to protect Manhattan, and one way to do it is with a seawall. Building vacation homes or homes on the beach is a very different matter. They don't have to be built there. It's very easy for people instead to build their vacation home inland on a lake if they like the water, right, rather than on the ocean.
Have you seen the movie Don't Look Up?
Yeah, I have, actually. It was fun.
So spoiler alert coming for those people who maybe have not seen it and who want to. There's some amusing parts to it, and there's some interesting conversation about it. There's a really nice, very thoughtful review of it by Scott Alexander, as one might expect. It's quite long and thoughtful. But in that movie, very, very your book reminds me of the movie, because the movies about an asteroid coming to hit the United States, where the scientific experts know with certainty that it's going to destroy not just the United States, but it's not toward the United States, toward the world. And they know with certainty it's going to destroy the world. And people just ignore it. And the analogy that's being, implicit analogy that's being made, I don't think it's so subtle, is that it's the same with climate change. The world's going to be destroyed and we just ignore it. We just rather not think about it. We're going to dance while the music plays on the deck of the Titanic. That's the implicit parallel there. And you're making a much more thoughtful point, which is that we're not sure it's going to destroy our world and that we should respond thoughtfully to that. What are your thoughts on where we're headed? I don't think the part I accept about the movie is I think a lot of people are somewhat oblivious to the evidence that there's a risk, at least, of the world being put into a catastrophic situation. Are we just going to muddle along and hope it isn't catastrophic, or do you think people like you are going to make some headway in thinking about these things?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen. Again, I hope that we will take action to try to reduce emissions. I hope that we will take actions to work on various forms of adaptation. I don't know what will actually happen. I can't forecast those things. But I do want to say one thing about this idea of the world coming to an end. So in the movie, an asteroid is actually a comet, hits the Earth and destroys the entire planet.
Yeah.
Destroys the entire planet. And so the analogy is, climate change is existential. It's going to destroy the world. And many people talk about it that way. The climate change is at an existential risk. Words used over and over again, is going to destroy the world. Now, we may have a very bad outcome. It may be, extremely severe. It's what I call a catastrophic outcome. The chance of destroying the world is low, very low. But what I talk about in not just the book, but much of my own research is that we face a number of catastrophic risks that threaten the human race. And climate change is one of them, but there are others that I think are more severe. I think that nuclear terrorism and nuclear warfare are far more dangerous and existential than climate change is. These are things that could happen in the next 5 or 10 years. These are things that could easily wipe out the whole world. And, we tend to ignore that. When you look at the number of nuclear weapons that exist, not just in the United States and Russia, but China, Britain, France, all around the world, Pakistan, India, you think about the use of those weapons. Will they ever be used? We hope not, but do you know that they'll never be used? So I thought, and what are the chances that bad people, terrorists, get a hold of some of those weapons and manage to bring them into a city in Europe or the United States and set off a Hiroshima-level bomb that wipes out a city? What would that do to the world economy? What would it do to the world? These are things that could indeed be existential risks. They're just terrible. We've had a pandemic. We've had a pandemic that isn't even close to what it did in the Spanish flu 100 years ago. Spanish flu 100 years ago killed about 4% of the population of the United States and Europe. 4%. COVID has killed a lot of people, but it's maybe 0.1%. It isn't even close to what the Spanish flu did. And if you look at the reports that came out of the CDC way before COVID happened, there were warnings that we're going to have really, really bad pandemics that are going to hit us. And it's going to be animal to human, and they're going to be terrible, and they could be much worse than the Spanish flu. Well, COVID was not that bad, but there's still the possibility of extremely severe pandemics that lie ahead. And there are other things that we could talk about, bioterrorism, for example, that I find severe existential risks more so than climate change.
I think the pandemic's really interesting. This is way beyond both of our pay grades, but I wanted to speculate for a second about it. It's true that it didn't kill anything like the Spanish flu did. And you could argue that was because it wasn't as severe as a pandemic. You could argue that we have better ways to mitigate it. We came up with a vaccine, and I love to say human beings came up with a vaccine in a remarkably short period of time. Recently did an episode on that with Greg Zuckerman, and a really fascinating story of innovation. But to me, the pandemic part of the pandemic is the least concerning, not the least, but is not even close to the whole story. It has torn the United States apart politically. It has created lunacy in how people respond and think about risk, and it's done real damage. I don't believe that there was I don't think it was a conspiracy. But it's a side effect of the release of that virus, wherever it came from, that it did severe damage to the political system of the United States. That's one argument. The other argument is, be anything. COVID's just the vehicle. Masks are just vaccines, mandates. They're just the vehicle for the expression of political tribalism. And it's just a symptom of an underlying problem. But it could be it actually just helped create it, and created such a visceral thing that doesn't have a common parallel. If it hadn't come along, wouldn't have this level of, to my mind, bizarro expression of self through political views of something that's public health. It's not about a real war with an enemy. It's not about an economic intervention that has uncertainty around it. It's extraordinary. You couldn't have scripted this seriously. It's much weirder than Don't Look Up. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's true. It's caused political splits. There's no question. But so is climate change. I mean, for the past decade, 2 decades, there are people who just say it's all made up. It's all just a hoax. Climate change has been incredibly divisive in terms, politically divisive. And we've had other divisions in the past. I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War, which was incredibly divisive in this country, incredibly divisive. So these things happen. I don't think that COVID was particularly a problem in that sense. And, we're going to have to figure out ways to deal with pandemics, with disease. There are big fights that existed before COVID over measles vaccinations. Do you vaccinate children before they can go to school? And a lot of people don't want their kids to be vaccinated against measles. So this has been a problem for a long time. It's not simply COVID.
Fair enough. Given those other risks, can't we worry about more than one thing at once? Is there any reason? So I happen to agree with you. I think the climate and the Earth itself is pretty vibrant and resilient. I used to think that was true of our political system. Not so sure lately, but okay. So there are other things that are maybe scarier than climate change, but can't we worry about all of them? Or do you think there's some trade-offs there in terms of focus, political energy, resources?
Well, I think right now we don't worry about much of anything. So
we can certainly worry about all, but the question is, can we do anything about it? Yeah.
You're starting from zero, so we don't worry about much of anything right now. And I think we got to worry about all these possible risks. And I think we have to spend a lot more money and resources. I mean, just take pandemics. The budget, at least prior to COVID, of the CDC, I think even through the beginning of COVID, the CDC's budget has dropped in real terms regularly, steadily. And, we don't spend much money right now on surveillance, worrying about new viruses, protecting ourselves against viruses, and so on. And we have to do more. These are serious, conceivably existential risks that we have to worry about. So it's difficult, and people don't want to spend money, and they don't want their taxes to go up, and they don't want the government to do much. But the fact is there are a variety of things we need to worry about. And we do need to spend more resources on all of these risks, on things ranging from climate to pandemics to nuclear terrorism and so on.
My guest today has been Robert Pindyck. His book is Climate Future. Bob, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.